Well, better way for Iran's government to control the narrative over its brutal and deadliest crackdown in decades and appear on the U.S. president's favorite and America's most watched news network. This is Brett Baer with the Iranian foreign minister.
Witnesses spoke of seeing snipers positioned on rooftops in downtown Tehran, firing into crowds of peaceful protests, turning abruptly into scenes of carnage, panic as bullets pierced through people's heads and torsos. You were saying that all of this is because you're not in control of your country and foreign elements are killing people inside your country?
No, I'm telling you that it was a fighting between our security forces and terrorist elements who had a plan to create a big number of killings in order to provoke President Trump to enter into this conflict and start a new war against Iran. And that was exactly an Israeli plot.
Journalists, politicians, and others have been trying to explain the situation in Iran. Is it A, organic protest stemming from decades of oppression and international sanctions, or is it B, manipulated and hijacked by foreign interests? Or is it C, a combination of the two? And since Donald Trump threatened strikes and promised help was coming to protesters, America was a perfect stage for any and all of these competing narratives. One of the loudest came from Reza Pahlavi, who lives in exile in the United States. He's the son of the Shah, who was overthrown in 1979 and has appeared on a variety of U.S. media like Fox News and CBS. He sought the center stage to legitimize his claim to be the next leader of Iran, despite not returning to the country in nearly 50 years. This is him in an interview with Britain's The Economist.
Many people, you have a number of, a reasonably large fraction of the Iranian population are fervent supporters of yours, but not everybody is. Not everybody is. What is the legitimacy that you are using to do this? Your father was not exactly a popular figure, and now you're coming in and saying, right, I'm here in charge again, and this is what I'm going to do.
I'm only responding to what people are asking for. What name has been chanted in the streets of Iran in the last few months? What name do you see be written on the walls? What slogans have they chanted in the recent weeks? They have chanted the name of my family. They have called for me specifically. I think that's pretty much of an indication of what the people want.
Al Jazeera looked at the fragmented opposition because there's a bitter feud among them over who should replace the supreme leader. Some say that the tension here, coupled with these competing international narratives, has undermined Iranian protesters' demands.
There's this false binary I keep seeing when it comes to Iran and some other countries. It's that if you recognize the Iranian protesters' demands as legitimate, you're somehow a mouthpiece for imperialist foreign powers that seek regime change in Iran. And I've seen the same tanky binary used to discredit popular discontent in Venezuela. You're either a lackey for Trump's imperialism or an authoritarian apologist. And if you cheered for the fall of the Assad regime, you must have been pro-Israel. All of these fallacies, these false binaries, completely ignore the lived reality of people who actually reside in these countries. They reduce their real human suffering to some sort of contest on a geopolitical chessboard.
And Iran's near total communications blackout has entered a second week. Activists say it's the country's longest in its long history of censorship. Reporters Without Borders ranks Iran in the bottom 5 on the World Press Freedom Index, and it says the situation is deteriorating. The blackout made it impossible for protesters to organize and for independent journalists in and out of the country to do their job. But far more important, it made it impossible for the world to see what was happening, how many people were arrested, hurt, or killed. Well, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Toronto is award-winning journalist Samira Mohyeddin from the On the Line media. Hello to you, Samira. Thank you for speaking to Scoop. First of all, as this blackout is ongoing, it's sometimes been reported as having been eased. Have you been able to reach anyone in Iran?
Actually, my friend's daughter reached out to me on a landline. I know that some people have been able to reach their family and friends through just regular phone, not through WhatsApp, which is generally how people connect. She told me that things are very bad where she is. She's in the northern part of Iran. She told me that drones are monitoring the streets, that there is a de facto martial law in place, and that where she is, there have not been any protests in the past 2 days.
Yeah, and that's a concern. And before it got to this point where the protests had eased, in the early days of the blackout, while they were still continuing to go out to the street, how were protesters managing to organize themselves amid that blackout?
I mean, I'm not sure how, I haven't been in touch with protesters. I'm not sure how they've been organizing. However, we have seen these horrific images of body bags in warehouses, bodies piled up on top of each other in morgues. And we have seen the funerals starting for these people who have been killed. Now, the narrative, as you pointed out, from the government is that these people are terrorists. And you really have Iranian protesters stuck between, these political pawns and a homegrown movement that is part of a successive amount of protests that have been really happening since 2017 nonstop.
Yeah, and when you're looking at this, from my perspective, someone who's not a specialist on Iran, I'm going on social media. I'm trying to make sense of what's happening, but it's flooded with propaganda, with disinformation, with influence campaigns. How do you recommend someone like myself, who might not be a specialist in the country, to cut through all that noise and filter it out?
I think the first thing I would point out is just because someone has OSINT in their name doesn't mean that, the work that they're doing is sincere or truthful. There is a lot of misinformation, as you said. A lot of people are posting videos that are from January 8th and January 9th, when we saw massive amounts of people in the streets, and they're writing things like the protests continue, and this is really coming, a lot of it from the Iranian diaspora, who wants to see, these protests continue. But at this point, the government, through their brutal actions, have been able to bring these protests under control.
What were your observations as you followed the story through international media about how they covered these protests, and also about what they said were the origins of these protests?
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is that the Western media specifically is not covering the reason why Iran's government is saying that this is a foreign hand. You had Israel's Channel 14 yesterday. Their diplomatic correspondent, Tamir Morag, went on X and posted that foreign actors have been arming protesters in Iran, and that's why you're seeing such a high number of Iranian security personnel being killed. And then he gave this sort of wink, wink, nod, nod, saying that Israel is the one responsible for this. And he's not the only one. Many Israeli officials and people like American officials like Mike Pompeo, who tweeted out, there are Mossad agents walking beside protesters. I mean, this type of bellicose statements are so reckless because you already have an Iranian government who always portrays these protests as being a foreign hand. But now they have a partner in that sort of messaging, and that partner is Israel.
Yeah, and to that end, Thursday evening, Narges Vajoli, a woman I think you know, published something that caught my eye. She said, quote, "One people's tyrant can never be another's liberator. When the U.S. and Israel claim to support Iranian freedom while committing genocide in Gaza, they reveal the lie. When they speak of democracy while kidnapping elected leaders and bombing sovereign nations, the mask falls," end quote. So what role should the Western media play in covering these Iranian protests?
I mean, I think covering the protests and saying that Mossad agents are on the ground are two completely different things. Of course, Western media should be covering these protests. They should provide historical context. They should do all of that. However, yesterday I saw a Sky News presenter who was speaking about the potential hanging of a protester named Erfan Soltani, say things like, and I just want to quote her specifically, she said, "Look at him, he looks like a Western identifiable man." And then the other protester said, "He looks like somebody you would walk past on the street." These are very racist statements to make about what Iranian people look like, or, how they're Western identifiable. I mean, what does that even mean as you're covering a potential hangee? These kinds of statements really should be called out. They just have no place in how these protests are covered. And yet we're seeing them over and over again.
With what we saw in Venezuela and then what's been threatened in Iran, so much analysis that the world is moving from a rules-based international order and toward these so-called spheres of influence. If that does happen, how will this affect the media? Will international journalists' job change? And do you think we are up to that task?
I mean, I think that when it comes to Iran in particular, there's not a lot of obfuscation on the part of how this is covered. I think generally the coverage is well. Again, I said that I think, this whole internet media blackout is a problem. Now, do I think that the Iranian government is going to go in and kidnap Khamenei and put him on trial? Absolutely not. Iran is the size of Western Europe. It is a country of more than 90 million people. We're not going to see Trump doing anything like that. And as you noted yourself, there has been a softening of the language on the part of the Americans. They're not making these sort of threatening statements anymore that we're locked and loaded and we're coming in to help. Now, the danger is that they're still telling people to go onto the streets of Iran and making statements such as help is on the way. So we're not seeing help on the way, and yet they're still telling protesters to go on the streets. One of the things I think that Western media can do in how it covers Iran, again, is to place these protests within the history of the other protests, not just give these flattened timelines as if these protests came out of nowhere. The other thing that they need to do is to really point out these crippling sanctions and the effects that they're having on Iran's economy. Let's not forget that these protests started in Tehran's Grand Bazaar by merchants when the rial dropped. I think that needs to be focused on a lot more.
All right. Thank you, Samira, so much. Samira Mohyeddin joining us from Toronto. And that brings us to our quote of the week. And it comes from a piece in The Guardian by Nasrin Parvin. And she says, quote, "The regime is terrorizing civilians, burning shops and destroying beautiful historic bazaars. Doctors are reportedly prevented from treating the wounded. Injured protesters are taken away from their hospital beds. But despite the killings, people are still in the street. They say they have nothing to lose but their chains." That's it for this edition of Scoop. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.